So you can hear the police minister speaking there about the fact that at least 10,000 people, the vast majority of women, were raped in South Africa between July and September. The highest number of these cases were reported at Temba Police Station in Hammanskraal, which has overtaken Lusikisiki in the Eastern Cape and Thohoyandou in Limpopo with cases of sexual assault and rape. Earlier today, Police Minister Bheki Cele releasing the second quarter crime statistics in Pretoria, as you heard him say. They also revealed that 64 more women and 69 more children were murdered compared to the same period in 2020 rather. So let's talk about the crime statistics. So for the period between July and September, which is what we're talking about, it showed that increase in murder, sexual offences, attempted murder and assault, equally increasing during the second period were arson and malicious damage to property. However, there was some decrease in robbery, cash and transit and truck hijacking crimes. Speaking at the National Assembly Committee on Police meeting, Minister of Police Bheki Cele said the country had a very bad July in terms of stability. Ziyanda Stuurman is author of Can We Be Safe? The Future of Policing in South Africa. She's an analyst on policing, policy and security analyst. So a very good evening to you and thank you so much for speaking to us, Ziyanda. Let's just first start perhaps with murders and rapes. So they've increased again compared to the second quarter of the previous year. Murder increasing by 1,056. The murder of children increasing by 31.7%. Talk us through those figures. And we've been asking about whether these figures are reflective of the everyday lives of South Africans.
Good evening, and thank you for having me on today. I think that, largely and broadly, our crime statistics as well as our crime reporting capabilities are actually quite reflective of essentially the crime situation in the country. Particularly, I think, around sexual offences and sexual assaults. Those statistics are, of course, coloured by the fact that many victims don't report those crimes to the police for very many reasons. More accurate as murders, tend to be reported quite accurately by communities, as well as murder dockets are certainly opened and those cases investigated to at least some extent. So I think that we do actually have quite a fair reflection of what's happening in the country. But of course, all of this should also be tempered against everything that happened during the July unrest this year, but particularly when looking at year-on-year crime stats and trends, that they're much higher now because of lower levels of lockdown than they would have been necessarily 12 or 18 months ago.
I mean, that figure of 31.7% increase in the number of children who were murdered is quite shocking. But I also want to look at the breakdown of the murders. 897 more women were murdered. So femicide, we know, is a big problem in South Africa. There have been various policies that have been mounted, but are they bearing any fruit? It's been almost 2 straight years now that we've been talking about this increase, but there seems to be no marked improvement.
That I certainly, share a lot of those sentiments and that assessment of the situation. I think that there are very many issues around there being no real and coherent strategy against gender-based violence, and certainly not one that cuts across the many sectors, which is necessary, not to just punish, those who have been found guilty or investigated, for offences, particularly against women, but even the prevention of gender-based violence itself in its many forms, which we know run the gamut really from the work that social development does to, and it touches on the work that the health sector does, not just the police. So I think that, when we sort of look at that statistic, it really is very telling of a multi-dimensional lack of capability to really put our arms around this issue and this crisis.
Let's talk about rape. That's shot up by 7.1% with 634 more cases being reported. you mentioned the fact that when it comes to murder, it is an accurate reflection of what's going on, because then dockets are opened, murder cases are reflected. But not so with rape, is it? And particularly of men.
Absolutely. Rape and sexual assaults are typically some of the least reported or underreported cases for very many reasons. Everything from victims feeling that they won't be believed, or they won't be heard, or even discouraged by family, by their community, by even the police themselves to a certain extent. And that's doubly true for a sexual assault against men, which is far more stigmatized and therefore underreported. That's not to say that there aren't organizations who are trying to do good work to get a much better and a more accurate idea of where these assaults are taking place. But it is just an incredibly difficult category of crime in and of itself to really truly understand, and crime statistics themselves, don't reflect the full picture.
I want to talk about this, the fact that sexual offences increased by 4.7%, and rapes between July and September were up 7.1% from the previous year. But the breakdown of provinces, we spoke about how it seems that the Eastern Cape has been overtaken, and Limpopo. Why are some of these provinces prone to high numbers of gender-based violence, of rape and sexual offences?
That's a really good question, and I think that many scholars who study specifically the incidence of sexual assault and gender-based violence, and sort of broadly speaking, those are scholars like Dr. Nahama Brody, as well as Professor Pumla Qola, all speak about the sort of demasculating or the sort of psychological issues around those who commit sexual violence, as well as victims who are targeted in those senses. If we're thinking about the Eastern Cape and Limpopo, we know that those are two provinces that economically are still quite rural, still quite underdeveloped, and in pockets have very high levels of unemployment, of poverty, and of inequality. And so in that sense, that's, I think, where you find an incredibly toxic and wicked brew of patriarchy, misogyny, sexism, masculinity, violence, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, all of those factors coming together to really create a space in which violence thrives. And in this case, particularly sexist violence and misogyny against women.
And that's why I find the statement that contact sexual offences declined by 37. What exactly does that mean? And perhaps if you could just break that down for us, because there are just so many labels to describe the brutalization of women, children, and in some cases men. Why is it important to have that delineation?
I think that's a great question, and exactly what you were saying, the sort of mislabeling in many ways of incidents. One incident that a police officer themselves is inputting data for the purposes of collecting crime statistics. Those individual police officers may have fairly different definitions of what they perceive to have been a crime committed and in which circumstance. So in that sense, it's not to say that we can't or we shouldn't trust the classification of crime categories. But I think to drill deep, both at the station level and at the provincial level, I think that's typically where you'll find a much better analysis of an issue, not necessarily at the national crime statistics level.
So as our viewers will see, we're saying that there were 2,000 kidnappings between the period of July and September. We started off our bulletin by relaying the incident of an 18-year-old who was able to fight off 4 men who tried to drag her into a car. And this is several days after another school child was kidnapped, was still missing. It seems, and I don't know if it's because of the prevalence of it in the news, the reportage thereof, but it just certainly seems like kidnappings are on the increase and they seem to be targeted. Talk to us about the actual figures that we're seeing. Is it a rising phenomena? What are you gleaning from the figures?
So I think that that's actually an incredibly important and interesting case of both perception and media narrative coming together to sort of paint a picture. So in this sense, it's there's been increased sort of media attention around these incidents of kidnapping. And even extortion. And immediately the case that comes to mind is that of the Moti brothers, who were kidnapped and then returned to their parents recently. So there's certainly a rise in the media attention around this phenomenon and this type of crime. And that's not to say that there isn't a rise in the type of crime itself. I think that there are many organized crime networks whose sort of modus operandi had to change over the past 2 years because of lockdown regulations, curfew regulations, and so their own criminal operations weren't working the same. And this might be a new sort of route or category of crime in which they're muscling their way into that sort of territory. Again, the incidents of crime such as kidnapping are not completely and utterly unique, to countries where there are high levels of inequality, especially where somebody could then kidnap someone for ransom. This happens often in Mexico, Nigeria, Colombia, and in other places.
All right. Ziyanda, which kind of covers a question that I wanted to ask about the incidence of human trafficking and, ensuring that we don't confuse that with what our family feuds, as some have pointed out, could be the motive behind it. But let's get into contact crime cases. They totaled 137,145, so that's an increase of 7.4%. What types of crimes are we talking about? And it always seems when we do reporting on crime figures that contact crimes are always on the increase.
That's correct. And actually, they've been on the increase over the past decade, not just recently or even this past year. So when we're talking about contact crimes, sort of roughly, we're talking about muggings, we're talking about assault, as well as assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. So we're talking about more of these kind of, if there's a way to put it, stranger danger type of crimes, in the sense that these are sort of interactions and on the personal level, and those type of crimes certainly have risen post the first sort of round of lockdowns, and especially as people get more and more desperate to earn any sort of form of income. We've seen over the past year the targeting of runners, for example, or joggers. Once lockdown levels were eased, and that became a sort of hotspot or an increase in crimes.
Ziyanda, quick and final question is around training. The minister is saying about 7,000 police members have received training as first responders. Are our police men and women equipped for the crisis levels of crime that we're seeing in our country, especially with regards to gender-based violence and femicide?
That's an excellent question, and a quick fire answer to that is that I think that there is training, but the resourcing isn't where it needs to be. Very many groups have spoken about the fact that in some communities that need more resources than others, there are fewer resources and fewer police officers. So if there was, training that was coupled with or layered with proper resourcing in hotspot communities, that could certainly make a difference, and certainly to the category of crime that is gender-based violence.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, sharing your insights. Ziyanda Stuurman, author of Can We Be Safe? The Future of Policing in South Africa. She's also the policy manager at UCT's Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab.